My father, who was a nuclear physicist and professor at a university near where we lived in upstate New York, took a summer research position at a laboratory in Livermore, California. This was about an hour east of San Francisco. So my folks organized a house exchange for the 2 months we'd be there and decided it was the perfect opportunity to take road trips there and back. In addition to me and my 9-year-old sister, Susan, we'd be taking our Labrador Retriever and our 2 cats. My parents would drive anywhere from 6 to maybe 10 hours a day, and they included time for us to spend at places of interest. They'd planned it all with the US equivalent of the RACV and had marked maps for every leg of the 8-day journey to California. My mom had even researched motels that accepted pets, although we planned to hopefully camp 2 nights out of every 3. So on a late June day, we headed west in our station wagon, our suitcases securely strapped to the roof rack. Me in the back seat with Douglas, the dog, and my sister in the back deck area with the 2 cats, Alexander and Blackie, and their litter box. The first glitch was that my sister and I had both come down with bad colds shortly before we left, including high fevers. Although the doctor had cleared us to travel, it didn't help that the outside temps were in the 90s, that's 30s centigrade, and our car did not have air conditioning. Our crankiness, with me complaining that the dog is drooling on me, and my sister complaining about the stinky litter box, wouldn't have been pleasant to travel with. I actually kept a daily diary report on this trip, and I still have it, which will be no surprise to my husband. I have everything I've ever owned, I think. Day 1's entry includes, it's crowded in here, Douglas is a pig. Our first day saw us traveling for about 10 hours west and then slightly southwest to Ohio by way of Niagara Falls in western New York State. Niagara Falls was a very impressive sight, although I have seen more impressive waterfalls since. Our first night was spent in a motel, for which I'm sure my folks were very thankful. The next day was only an 8-hour drive to Indiana Dunes State Park for our first night of camping. One of my entries for day 2 says, Douglas is slobbery. We camped on the shores of Lake Michigan. Our tent was a 4-person one, or should I say a 4-person, 1 large dog and 2 cats one. If you got up in the night to use the facilities, you'd come back and find all 3 animals on your sleeping bag. That night, my mom woke up and heard a rustling sound. She peered out the tent window and saw a family of raccoons unwrapping and eating the hard lollies we'd left on the picnic table. Our alleged watchdog, Douglas, however, slipped right through it. Day 3 was very long, about 11 hours, and it took us straight west across Illinois and across the mighty Mississippi into Iowa to Council Bluffs, Iowa. Iowa is very, 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 very flat and full of cornfields. We stayed in a motel again, but Douglas was afraid to walk up the stairs to our first floor room because the steps were open and he could see between them when he was going up. As a result, my dad had to carry this 35-kilo dog up the stairs after every bathroom break. But that night, poor Douglas obviously had nightmares of the scary steps. He was whimpering and churning his legs in his sleep. The next day was rainy, and just outside of Council Bluffs, we saw a line storm. These are storms where when you look at the horizon ahead, you see a giant thundercloud stretching from north to south for as far as you can see, and lightning bolts coming down along from them the whole way, all at the same time, as many as 9 or 10 at once. It's quite an impressive sight. I think my kids were feeling better by that point, but there was another slight glitch. My sister had low blood pressure and a tendency to faint. She had salt tablets for this, and she would alert my mother if she felt faint and then be given one. One afternoon, we were both sitting in the back seat, and she said to me, "Tell Mom I'm going to faint." And then she fainted. Because it didn't seem hugely worrisome or urgent since she had already fainted and couldn't take the tablet, I said very quietly, "Mom, Susan fainted." Of course she didn't hear me. Susan then came to and yelled, "Mom, I fainted!" And of course I got told off for not alerting her right away, despite my assertions that I did. Our trip that day was only about 6 hours, mostly northwest, ending in a campground in the Badlands National Park in South Dakota. The Badlands are an area of very dramatic landscapes and layered rock formations that almost resemble a moonscape. And in fact, many films about both the Old West and about places in outer space are filmed there. It was named originally by the native Lakota, and with a word that meant, the land here is bad. And indeed, much of it is just sand and rock. Many fossils of prehistoric mammals have also been found there. During the night, there was a torrential rainstorm, so in the morning we found mud all around and all over our tent as well. It was still raining as my poor parents tried to pack up the tent and everything and everyone. Once the car was loaded with our sodden stuff, we drove a short distance into Wall, South Dakota, home of the famous Wall drugstore. This is a huge store, and this was well before the giant Walmarts, and it included under its roof a collection of cowboy-themed shops, an actual drugstore, a gift shop, several restaurants, various other stores, an art gallery, and an 80-foot, that's 24-meter, Brontosaurus statue, and a laundromat. It's a tourist attraction that gets over 2 million visitors a year. My parents were able to wash and dry our tent in the industrial machines there. We had breakfast there, and then off we went. Next stop, Mount Rushmore. This giant sculpture carved into the stone of the mountain features 8-meter-high faces of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln. Sadly for me, no Alexander Hamilton, although I wasn't as obsessed back then. I probably didn't know who he was, aside from being on the $10 bill. The next day was a relatively short drive west to Buffalo, Wyoming, and a night in a motel from where we could see the snow-capped Rockies. The very next day, we actually stopped in the Rockies and let Douglas play in the snow. While we were there, another car stopped, and the people turned out to be from our home city, some 2,000 miles back east. Not only that, they knew neighbors of ours. We continued west to Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, where we again camped for the night. I have a photo somewhere of Blackie, our older cat, on his lead, peering over a ledge near our tent towards a moose in the valley. We also stopped our car, along with quite a few others one time, when bears were sighted along the road. An older cub approached our car, and yes, our windows were up, and stood up and put his paws on the door, obviously hoping for a handout. The cats cowered together on the top of the esky, and Douglas went berserk barking. After a minute, the bear seemed annoyed by the pesky barking and wandered off. In Yellowstone, we visited the geyser Old Faithful and several other iconic features of the park, like the thermal pools and mud volcanoes. We also saw buffalo, elk, and more bears. After a late start the next day, we drove south to Salt Lake City, Utah. Utah had a lot of road construction at the time, as well as super bumpy roads, huge traffic jams, and very unhelpful signs. We were lost for a while. This leg became an 11-hour trip. We were now behind schedule and had to look for a motel. We finally turned into the parking lot of a motel with a vacancy, the slight bump over the curb, which was the last straw for our roof rack, which fell off into the footpath in one large pile. My dad had obviously packed it very securely, however, as aside from slight damage to one suitcase, the actual load stayed intact. I don't even remember now how we got everything back off the footpath and onto the car, but I do remember that we had to sneak the animals into the room.
Jesus.
We were up early the next day and started a 7-hour trip to Reno, Nevada, which was slightly southwest. We passed huge salt flats in Utah on the way. We stayed in a motel, and my notes say that I gave my parents some coins to put in a 5-cent slot machine for me, and I won 15 cents. Most motels and hotels gave all the guests rolls of nickels, the 5-cent pieces, maybe $2 worth, I guess, because they wanted to encourage you to try the machines. We also discovered that food was super cheap in the casinos because they just want you in there so you'll gamble. The following day was our last day on the road to California, and it was only 4 hours slightly southwest. We arrived at our house for the summer, unpacked and relaxed. It truly was the road trip of a lifetime, and one my sister and I still remember with great pleasure. We saw and learned so much about the U.S., and also realized that our parents truly were saints. During the next 2 months in California, we took many small road trips to San Francisco, to Yosemite National Park, Lake Tahoe, Los Angeles, and Disneyland, among others. And then the big road trip back home to New York, this time via the South. But that's a road trip for another story.